Like many other kids who grew up in the early 2000s and 2010s, I grew up with anime and cartoons like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Creep School, and of course, Avatar, The Last Airbender. I loved Avatar, to the point where I could cite some of the episodes, word for word. It was a type of love for a work of art, only possible in the mind of a child. The impact that the show has had on an entire generation can be summed up through the fact that we can all recite the opening narration, no matter how long it's been since we last saw an episode. Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender is, to me, a slightly below average show. But in the shadow of what might be the best show ever made, it's at best passable, and at its worst, disrespectful to the source material. Before we start the video, these are some of the videos that I've personally watched, and in some cases they explain my thoughts perfectly, so check them out through the description down below. Also, I guess, spoiler warning for the original show as well as the Netflix adaptation. While I have a lot of negative things to say about the Netflix adaptation, there were a few things that I did like, so let's start out with the good. First off, the set design and costumes were, honestly, pretty great. It was easy to differentiate the different nationalities based on the color of their clothing, something that is very prominent in the original series. The temples, the cities, and overall decor made the world feel lived in. And especially Omashu felt like it was a faithful rendition from what we can gather from the animated show. I didn't mind that they were trying to make a darker, more grittier version, since that goofy and fun nature of a cartoon is impossible to get in a live-action setting. The actors themselves didn't pull me out of the story, and the standout performance for me was definitely Zhao, who not only delivers every line perfectly, but is the perfect embodiment of what I think Zhao should be. The actor and the director somehow made the, for me, best possible version of Zhao in a live-action setting.
Which is why I suggest you allow me to contact a few trusted sources.
I also want to point out the heavy lifting done by Dallas James Liu as Zuko, as well as Ian Ousley as Sokka. While I don't necessarily believe either of them always had the best lines, they always did what they could with what they were given. And while we're on the topic, I may as well just say that I don't find any issues with any of the casting choices. And I think Gordon Cormier as Aang is a good version of Aang, and he works well versus the older, more experienced actors. And any of my issues with the characters come directly from writing and direction rather than poor performances. In general, the bending looks good, and one of the standout scenes for me was actually the intro to the show. Seeing the Earthbender lift a bunch of tiny rocks and then send them away at the speed of sound is everything that the M. Night Shyamalan version could dream to be. I also really enjoyed the inclusion of Avatar Kyoshi and Kuruk. Seeing more past avatars other than Roku really helps with the notion that the avatar has existed for a generation, and that despite being reanimations of each other, they all have their own different personalities. But sadly, this is where the good ends, and we're moving on to the bad. The waterbending at certain points felt a bit weak. It never felt very impactful or heavy-hitting, and to me personally, seeing them retrieve water from a moving body of water felt a bit unnatural. Now, I'm not saying that magically moving water is natural, but it felt as if the bending worked against the stream, not with it, which is a core philosophy of bending. Oh, and once again, in some of these videos, they've discussed that the earthbending in certain situations feels a bit lackluster. I also would like to point out one of the main issues with the first scene with Aang. He's sitting at the top of the temple, and when he's called upon, he flies down. He doesn't glide down, he flies down. They give Aang, and by extension all of the Airbenders, the ability to fly, which not only raises more questions, but it also ruins what makes bending feel so great to watch. While a bending master does have some control over the element, there are still laws of which the magic system adheres to. Giving the Airbenders the ability to fly opens up the possibility for way more crazy abilities, especially since Aang does it so casually. It honestly feels like a type of ability similar to metal bending. Something that a master bender could learn through a lot of patience, practice, or potentially spirituality. But the issue here is that it's supposed to be an immense feat, something not available to everyone. Some people do give looks or points, and Gyatso even says, "Show off." But no one seems overly impressed, which means that this is a commonly known ability. While I do believe that the actors did what they could with the script and direction given, there are major flaws with the writing and the dialogues. The absolute main issue of the show as a whole is the exposition dumping and the narrative's dependency on conversations to show a character's emotions, wants, and plans. It's almost as if they wrote the show for toddlers. Children who can't deduce complex emotions through subtle changes in expression or through cinematographic techniques. You can't both make a darker and grittier show for the kids who grew up with the original, but then write as if they can't draw conclusions or think for themselves. There are way too many offenders of this to where I can't show all of them, but here's a few examples. In episode 1, Aang feels overwhelmed by his responsibility as the Avatar, and then he goes and talks to Appa about his feelings.
I'm supposed to save the world? He said, I need to remember who I am. But I know who I am. I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends. That's who I am. Not someone who can stop the Fire Nation. Not someone who can stop a war.
There's no moping by the window. There's no not being allowed to play games with his friends. And the rain, which is supposed to symbolize his inner turmoil, is merely a plot device that makes him fall into the water. Zuko continuously explains the reason for his voyage throughout the entire season, and it's always with the same whiny affliction.
My father has banished me until I find the Avatar, and that's exactly what I'll do. If word gets out, everyone in the world will be looking for him. I could lose everything.
There were times I thought I'd never find the Avatar. Now the chance to go home is real. My father made it very clear that I'm not to return until I find the Avatar.
But the absolute worst offender of this, at least to me, is this scene between Zhao and Iroh.
Zhao, you're not thinking of tampering with the spirit world, are you? Are you? You're going to kill the ocean and moon spirits?
There is literally no subtlety. Iroh essentially says, Zhao, are you going to kill the spirits twice in a row? While Zhao is making this the most redundant possible question. And this also carries perfectly over to the second biggest issue in the show, in my opinion. That the characters are boring. Maybe you could say that Sokka had some character development, but we'll touch more on that later. But other than that, literally not a single other of the main characters has any development in the entire 8 episodes. For some characters, this might have been fine, But for all of them, especially the main cast, it's infuriating. Aang starts out as a kid who is afraid of being the Avatar and for some reason won't learn waterbending. And it isn't really until the final episode where he has a slight change of heart and decides to fuse with the water spirit. The issue with this is that literally in the episode before, he was thinking about leaving Katara and Sokka because he was afraid that his position as the Avatar would put them in harm's way. If your character's entire development happens in a 5-minute scene at the end of an 8-hour-long series, it doesn't feel earned, especially if there was never a hint of him changing in the previous episodes. Katara goes from being a hopeful but slightly naive girl who has a lot to learn about waterbending into a hopeful but slightly naive girl who has learned a little bit of waterbending. While I do appreciate that we got to see the gang fight during the show, this version of Katara being able to stand against Pakku is very much unbelievable. Not only does this version of Katara feel less naturally confident in her bending abilities than the animated counterpart, but she lacks the intensity in her personality to convey the strength that the rage in the fight against Pakku gives her. Part of the reason why that scene hits so hard in the original is because of the rage, the fear, and the stakes that fight had for Katara. Despite being an animated character, you still feel the adrenaline rush that she has during the fight, and she doesn't become a master just because she held her own against Pakku for a few minutes. It also helps that the animated show shows Katara fighting, learning, and overall getting a lot better at bending during their travels towards the north in episodes like Batu of the Water Tribe, Yet, or Imprisoned. Even the way Katara is introduced in two shows indicates their different level of ability. Katara in the animated show can move a fish out of the moving water, and through raw power is able to crack open the iceberg that Aang is stuck inside, while Netflix's Katara is very timid and can barely lift a small ball of water out of a still pond. Zuko is potentially the most rushed character in the show, in my opinion. While the original did sow a few seeds of his inner personality, it was still covered by a rage-filled mask which was impossible to interpret as anything else but the show's main antagonist. Scenes where Zuko decides not to burn Zhao after beating him in the Agni Kai, or where he keeps the ship safe rather than following Aang, is enough for us to know that he has some humanity, while not having to explicitly say Zuko is a good person because he saved the 41st Division. I did like that change overall, that the division that Zuko saves is now his crew, but it could have been done in a more subtle way. Maybe in a way where not everyone who saw the show would have understood it on a first watch, but for those who did understand it, it would have been a much stronger moment. Seeing Zuko and Zhao side by side in the original series, we saw two antagonists to Team Avatar. But in the Netflix adaptation, I see Zuko, the kid with a reason, and then Zhao, the power-hungry maniac. Sure, Zhao was also set up as an antagonist to Zuko in the animated show as well, but you're not really supposed to sympathize with Zuko this early in the series. You can't both root for the hero and the main villain. And to me, it felt as if the writer or whoever decided on how Zuko was supposed to be in the show couldn't differentiate who he is at the start and who he becomes at the end of season 3. Once again, I just want to say I don't think it's any of the actors' fault. It's 100% the writing and direction that is at fault here. And while I do think that Zuko was handled a bit poorly, the most disappointing character to me was Iroh. Iroh is supposed to be a chill guy. An uncle who you can go with your everyday struggles with, but also those deeper issues which you feel afraid to go to your dad with. He's funny, charming, yet highly relatable. The way he interacts with Zuko, despite Zuko being cold, shows how much he cares. He's empathetic, he's not afraid of joking with the enemy, and when he needs to be, he can be frighteningly competent. The Netflix adaptation of Iroh turned him into something much less nuanced. He's still generally calm, but he's drained of all of his humor and the respect-inducing aura. There's no thanking Zhao for the ginseng tea, which then leads to an amazing moment between Zuko and Iroh.
Even in exile, my nephew is more honorable than you. Thanks again for the tea.
Zuko asks Iroh if he really meant what he said about Zuko being more honorable than Zhao.
Did you really mean that, Uncle?
Of course. I told you ginseng tea is my favorite.
Iroh knew what he was doing in that moment. He didn't need to tell Zuko that he really meant what he said, because their relationship was already that strong. It also gives Iroh a joke, which alleviates some of the tension from the tense Agni Kai. To me, this is a core scene in Zuko and Iroh's relationship. And the Netflix adaptation completely ruins this by 1. Moving the scene to the final episodes, 2. Having Zuko's choice of not hurting Zhao actually just be a fit of rage, kind of like your neighbor Kyle got killed by a kid in Call of Duty and then punched the wall. And then thirdly, how Iroh unceremoniously kills Zhao and then just walks away from the scene. There's no telling Zuko that he's honorable, there's no telling him that he's proud of him for not hurting Zhao, despite Zhao being so obviously horrible. The spirit world was underutilized, it wasn't very interesting to watch, and it lost some of its exclusivity. The same way we now think that almost any airbender could technically fly, the spirit world is now available for anyone who is close by to someone who is spiritual as they meditate. Now I know Sokka gets spirited away in the episode where Heibai transports humans to the spirit world, but that is a specific decision by one of the spirits to take the humans to the spirit world. In the Netflix adaptation, Katara and Sokka just appear in the spirit world by no power of their own. What's even weirder is that we see them walking around before they appear in the spirit world. What's even weirder is that they've fallen asleep, which technically means that they entered the spirit world before Aang, and that they were just walking around there waiting for him to join them. The inclusion of Wan Shi Tong, while not necessarily a bad idea, feels a bit weird as he's known to stay inside his library and let his foxes of knowledge, also known as knowledge seekers, gather the information that he seeks. I also personally don't like the fact that Katara and Sokka only hears owl sounds. They're in the spirit world. It's okay if they understand the big owl spirit which speaks English. Heibai is basically irrelevant to the story. He's there for a scene. There's no conclusion to Heibai's story. Aang doesn't help the spirit of the forest, and as far as we know, Heibai is still that angry monster, and not that sweet panda. The way they've included and presented Ko is honestly, infuriating. Ko is supposed to be frightening. His aura is supposed to be anxiety-inducing, and personally he's given me nightmares and is actually the basis of my sleep paralysis demon. The constant threat of showing any type of emotion is horrifying, and it turns every word, every conversation, every second with Ko into a feat of determination. While I don't hate the CGI, and I did appreciate the inclusion of some of his backstory, like the part of him being the child of the Mother of Faces, is actually two good parts, but they're also the only good parts about Ko's inclusion. He is creepy, sure, but any giant centipede monster would be frightening. But this version of Ko lacks the psychological terror which the animated version presents so beautifully. Part of why Ko is scary is because we know what happens when he steals someone's face, and also the fact that Aang is in this constant battle against his own emotions. In the Netflix adaptation, Ko just kinda appears and gives Aang all of the hints that he needs to save his friends, without actually having to struggle. It feels unearned and disappointing to see one of these intense moments turn into what is essentially a story dump. And it also doesn't help that Aang is so obviously frightened in the situation, when you know that that is what Ko is attracted to. While the Netflix adaptation has a long enough runtime where it could create a universe that feels lived in, it fails. Especially compared to the original show, which according to this person is an hour and 12 minutes longer, you can really feel the effects of missing those episodes and environments. Part of the reason why the original show feels larger is because we get to see and explore a lot of different places. The Northern Air Temple, the Perfumer's Abbey, as well as Jongjong's hut are just a few of the areas that are not present in the adaptation. Cutting out and combining different episodes is a good idea, for money and time. What was a journey, where we could learn about the universe, see the characters grow, and find villages with characterized people, turned into what feels like a rushed road trip filled with conveniences. Yes, in the original, the gang also had the goal to reach the North Pole, but it didn't really have that same sense of urgency until episode 8, almost halfway through the first season. And even then we had episodes like The Great Divide, The Fortune Teller, or The Deserter, which were more focused on exploring the characters or expanding the universe rather than reaching a destination. Netflix, by introducing the threat of the invasion of the North, not only removes the ability for the gang to take it easy and get to know each other, but they also turn the looming threat from the comet to the invasion. I understand that having a 1-year limit isn't an option. The actors, especially the kids, are gonna grow up and change. But the fact is that the comet that's far away, but not that far away, is a better motivating factor for the characters overall. Introducing the impending doom forces Aang to be focused on one specific task rather than giving the heroes the chance to learn at their own pace. This could so easily have been remedied by having Kyoshi just tell them about the comet rather than the invasion of the North. Maybe she didn't even have to give them a specific time frame like Roku does in the original. Hell, maybe even Roku brings it up when Aang shows up at his temple, saying something like, "I can feel it when it's closing in," being just vague enough to where there is a sense of urgency, but it's not the only important matter, like the invasion of the North ends up being in the Netflix adaptation. It really is crazy how different it ends up being when the decision to go to the north goes from, hey, we need to find Aang a waterbending master, to we need to go to the north so they don't kill every single waterbender so we can't learn anymore. They literally end up hurrying so much that Aang never bends any water in Season 1. The Book of Water. There is a lot wrong with the way the story is presented, and while most of it is just bad, some of it is pure ugly. First and foremost, let's discuss Sokka. There's already multiple videos that highlight the fact that they've removed Sokka's sexism, but I feel like I have to bring it up here, too. And the thing is, they remove Sokka's sexism, but they don't remove sexism as a whole. Sokka is characterized as a young, naive, and prideful teenager at the beginning of the original show. He has a huge respect for his father, who he sees as the pinnacle of a leader, and as we learn, he doesn't see women as warriors. It's understandable for his character to have this disposition. He grew up largely without a mother, which then skewed his perception of societal roles, as well as impacting how he interacts with the women in his life. The beautiful thing about Sokka in the original show is that he talks, listens, and learns from the women around him. Suki shows that women can be strong as well. Katara shows that women can have ingenuity. And Yue, while only being there for a short while, teaches Sokka compassion. Sokka's growth in the original show is only matched by Zuko's. He's quick to accept the Kyoshi warriors as stronger fighters, and he doesn't even have to struggle with that fact. And then in the end, he also gets the girl, since Suki gives him a kiss. Sure, Suki in the original also gives him a kiss, but it's a kiss on the cheek not necessarily meant to show an attraction, but rather to reinforce the idea that not all warriors are men, and warrior women aren't just warriors. It doesn't help that Yue also falls for him in like 2 days. Netflix's need for a romance feels way more sexist than what Sokka's sexism in the original show ever felt. Suki, while it's understandable that she would be sheltered, is still supposed to be a strong and independent woman, someone who is capable of complex emotions and actions. She would be interested in any visitor, sure, but making it a romantic interest rather than just an interest of knowledge and experience, to me seems more harmful than Sokka saying that she can't be a warrior because she's a woman, and then being proved wrong. And the same thing goes for Yue. A lot of people have talked about the hairpiece, and I honestly don't see any issues with it. A lot of the other things in the show look way too clean and like cosplay a tiny bit anyway, so I'm not really that bothered by it. No, the issue is that the relationship feels forced. Sokka just kinda gets the girl without us seeing any of the cute stuff that made it feel natural in the original. There's not really that awkward phase that there should be, and it kinda just feels like Sokka likes her for her pretty outside. Like, he still likes that in the original show as well, but in scenes with Han, for example, where Han talks about the perks of dating Yue, you can see that Sokka actually really cares. He even makes her a sculpture, which is a physical embodiment of how much he's grown. The Netflix adaptation of Sokka feels respectful, and he does open up to Yue, which I think is a good thing. But his character development is stunted, and he's a bit bland because they've removed parts of his character from where he could grow. I also think that it's pure ugly to see how these selfless, strong young women be turned into what is essentially just pure love interests for Sokka. Speaking of ugly, we need to talk about Boomy. No, I'm not talking about his appearance. I'm talking about how they took a fun, loving, and crazy character who felt like a mix between a loose cannon and a highly calculated genius, and turned him into an angry, boring old man who has nothing but hatred towards Aang. This to me feels like character assassination. The original Boomy was kind, funny, and understanding, and he was just happy to have his old best friend back. Luckily enough, this far, he hasn't had any impact on the story or the characters, so it's okay. I haven't spoken about Ozai or Azula yet, and honestly, I don't know what to say. Giving Ozai a face is probably a good thing. I don't mind the idea of giving him some characterization, rather than being a blank slate of pure evil. However, I don't think it was done very well. I do like how he manipulates Azula to hate Zuko more, but the entire scene where he banishes Zuko doesn't make sense at all in my opinion, and it just feels way out of character. In the animated show, he sends Zuko away because he despises him. He's ashamed to have him as a son, and he sends him on a task that everyone believes to be impossible. The live action version almost makes it seem like it's a pity to send Zuko away, like he's doing it for his own good to make him stronger. The fight between Ozai and Zuko is also so incredibly bad in my opinion. The fact that it's actually a fight is crazy to me. The whole point is for Zuko to beg for forgiveness. There is no world where Zuko is supposed to fight back. Further, Zuko actually ends up with the edge on Ozai, but he decides to spare his father. You realize that Ozai now seems like he's weaker than a 14-year-old kid, right? This version of Ozai is much less frightening than the man whose pure presence can make his son whimper and cry for forgiveness. Azula is also, of course, impacted by a lot of these changes. And actually her inclusion to me feels very weird, because she really does nothing else other than complain that Ozai is liking Zuko more than her. She also just happens to be the subject of the second worst scene in the show, in my opinion. The introduction to Lightning Generation is extremely poorly done, in my opinion. Hell, the concept is not even introduced until season 2 of the animated show. The animated show shows Iroh redirecting lightning in the episode The Storm, so fire and lightning is already connected. But seeing Iroh using the redirection in a calm mind with the purpose of protecting the ship is such a great way to introduce the concept, as it's used to defend and protect so many times in the future. There's also this philosophy that Iroh talks about in season 2 of when interacting with lightning, you need to have a calm mind, while in the Netflix adaptation, Azula kind of just generates it because she's angry. Yes, Azula does generate lightning by the end of season 3 as well when she goes completely crazy, but I think to some degree we can probably chalk that up to her just being very naturally gifted, as well as it being one of her more practiced abilities. My issue is honestly just with the fact that lightning generation, and therefore any other future lightning abilities, will be associated with anger and violence. I think it's time to discuss what I believe is the most disrespectful scene. The scene that prompted this entire video. Lu Ten's funeral. I've already described how Iroh is a way less interesting character in the Netflix adaptation. This scene shows Zuko showing respect to Lu Ten, and strengthening the bond between Zuko and Iroh. However, we don't know this version of Iroh nearly close enough for the death of his son to really be impactful on us. And we've already seen that Iroh cares a lot for Zuko throughout all of their interactions in the previous episodes, so this scene really doesn't develop their relationship further. And on top of all of that, they use the song Leaves from the Vine in the background. I can't say that song's name without getting a chill down my spine. The Tale of Iroh, for an Avatar fan, might be the best 4 minutes of animation ever created. We get to follow a character who we've come to love through his kindness, understanding, and compassion, spend a day helping a variety of young men, only to have the emotional conclusion of learning that it's his dead son's birthday. Mako Iwamatsu, the original voice actor for Iroh, sings this beautiful lullaby in honor of Iroh's son. Mako was diagnosed with esophageal cancer and died of complications in 2006. Singing this song was his last contribution to the show. Greg Baldwin, the voice actor for Iroh from season 3 and onwards, has stated on Twitter that he won't perform Leaves from the Vine, saying, "It's Mako's song, not mine." The disrespect of using this man's song in a scene where we don't even feel any actual emotional impact is, to me, disgusting, and it might be the ugliest implementation of a song that I've ever heard. When I heard that they were using that song, I literally got up and yelled "F you" multiple times. Because it's not earned, it's disrespectful, and in comparison to the original, it's just a piece of terrible fan service. I know I've been very critical in this video, but I really care about this animated show a lot. Most of these issues don't make the show completely unwatchable, but I think it is fair to be critical when there is a previous framework they could have used to enhance the overall story. If you didn't find me unwatchable during this video, feel free to leave a like or subscribe for more content like this. I would also love to hear all of your thoughts down below. My name's Turtle-kun. Remember to eat well, sleep well, and I will see you in the next video.